The worst betrayal isn't the one you see, it's the one you hear through a door you thought was safe. I remember standing in the hallway, my hand frozen inches from the knob, my heartbeat so loud it felt like it might echo through the walls, because on the other side of that door, my door, I heard her laugh, soft, familiar, careless, like she had every right to be there, like she had always belonged there, and for a second I told myself I was wrong, that it was the TV, a phone call, anything but the truth pressing against my chest. But then I heard his voice, low, comfortable, unmistakable, and something inside me didn't shatter all at once, it cracked slowly, quietly, like glass under pressure, and I just stood there, listening, not moving, not breathing, because opening that door would make it real, and as long as I stayed still, I could pretend I still had a life waiting for me on the other side. But the laughter didn't stop, it grew warmer, closer, more intimate in a way that didn't need to be seen to be understood. And that's when I realized the cruelest part wasn't what they were doing, it was how easy it sounded, how natural, like I had already been replaced long before I found out, like I was the only one still holding on to something that had already ended, and my fingers curled into my palm as I stepped back, one slow step at a time, careful not to make a sound, because I didn't want them to know I knew, not yet, not like this, not when I still had some piece of dignity left to protect. And I turned away from that door, from that version of my life, and walked down the stairs like a stranger in my own house, each step heavier than the last, until I reached the bottom and saw him, standing there in the dim light of the entryway, as if he had been there the whole time, watching, waiting, his presence so still it almost felt unreal, like he didn't belong in the same world as the chaos upstairs, tall, composed, dressed in a way that made everything around him look temporary, his eyes lifting to meet mine with a calm that unsettled me more than anger ever could, and for a moment neither of us spoke, because somehow he already knew. I could see it in the way his gaze didn't ask questions, didn't offer sympathy, just observed, measured, as if he were looking at a situation, not a girl whose world had just shifted beneath her feet, and I should have looked away, should have walked past him and left that house behind forever, but I didn't, because something about the silence between us felt heavier than everything I had just heard, and when he finally spoke, his voice was low, controlled, almost thoughtful. It didn't sound like comfort, it sounded like a conclusion. "You didn't open the door," he said, and I swallowed, my throat dry, my hands still trembling at my sides. "I didn't need to," I whispered, and he nodded once, like that answer confirmed something for him, like he had expected it, and then he added, softer this time, almost to himself, "Good," and I didn't understand why that word sent a chill down my spine, why it felt less like reassurance and more like the beginning of something I couldn't see yet, something that had nothing to do with my sister or my ex anymore, something that had already started the moment I chose not to walk away. I should have left, but I did not, and that was the first mistake I could not undo, because instead of walking out into the cold night and never looking back, I stayed exactly where I was, standing at the bottom of the stairs with a man who felt more dangerous in his stillness than anything waiting for me upstairs, and the silence stretched just long enough to become a choice, one I did not realize I was making, until he stepped closer, not invading, not forcing, just closing the distance in a way that made it impossible to pretend we were strangers sharing the same space, and I caught the faint scent of something expensive, something controlled, like every detail about him had been decided in advance, and I hated that I noticed it, hated that my mind could register anything other than the sound of my sister's laughter still echoing in my head. But that was the thing about shock. It did not come as screaming or chaos. It came as clarity, sharp and quiet, making everything feel too real, too precise, and when he spoke again, it was not a question, it was an observation. "You are thinking about going back up there," and I let out a breath I did not realize I had been holding, shaking my head before I could stop myself. "No," I said, my voice steadier than I felt, "there is nothing up there for me anymore," and something shifted in his expression. Not surprise, not approval, something more subtle, like acknowledgement. And he tilted his head slightly, studying me in a way that made me feel seen and exposed at the same time. "Good," he repeated, softer now, and I frowned, because that word again, it did not sound like comfort, it sounded like a door closing behind me, like a path being sealed without my permission, and I crossed my arms, more to hold myself together than to defend anything. "Why are you here?" I asked, because that felt like the only question that mattered, and for a moment he did not answer, his gaze drifting briefly toward the staircase, toward the life I had just walked away from, before returning to me. Because I do not like unfinished business, he said, and the way he said it made my stomach tighten, not because it was threatening, but because it was calm, too calm. Like he had already decided what this situation meant long before I understood it myself. This is not your business, I replied, a little sharper than I intended, and for the first time, something almost like amusement touched his eyes, brief and gone before I could be sure it was real. It became my business the moment it happened under my roof, he said, and that was when it hit me, not just who he was, but what that meant, not just Jason's father, but something more, something heavier, something that carried weight in the way people moved around him, in the way the air itself seemed to adjust. When he spoke, and I looked at him differently then, really looked, at the way he held himself, at the quiet authority that did not need to be announced, and I felt something unfamiliar settle under my skin, not fear exactly, but awareness, like standing too close to the edge of something deep, and I should have stepped back, should have created distance, but instead I stayed, because walking away now would mean returning to a version of my life that no longer existed, and he seemed to understand that without me saying a word, because he gave a small nod, almost to himself, before speaking again. Then do not go back, he said simply, and I blinked, caught off guard by how direct it was, how final. Where would I go? I asked, more honestly than I intended, and he held my gaze, steady and unflinching. Anywhere that is not there, he replied, and something about the way he said it made it sound less like advice and more like a decision already made, and I realized, standing there in that quiet hallway, that I was no longer just reacting to what had happened upstairs. I was stepping into something else entirely, something I did not understand yet, something that had nothing to do with betrayal and everything to do with the man standing in front of me, and the worst part was not that I felt uncertain, it was that a small, dangerous part of me did not want to turn away. The front door closed behind me with a soft click that sounded louder than anything that had happened upstairs, like a line drawn between who I was 10 minutes ago and whoever I was about to become, and the cold air outside hit my face, sharp and grounding, but it did not clear my head the way I expected it to, because I could still feel him behind me, not touching, not crowding, just there, a presence that did not need to move to be felt, and I wrapped my arms around myself, not from the temperature but from the strange weight settling in my chest, the kind that comes when everything familiar disappears all at once. You should go back inside, I said, even though I did not turn around, because looking at him felt like acknowledging something I was not ready to name, and for a moment there was only silence, the kind that stretched just long enough to make me think he might ignore me. But then his voice came, calm and certain. You should not tell me what I should do, and I let out a quiet breath, something between frustration and disbelief, because there it was again, that subtle shift, that quiet control woven into simple words, and I finally turned, meeting his eyes under the dim porch light, noticing the way he seemed completely unaffected by the chaos he had just witnessed, as if this kind of thing did not surprise him, as if people disappointing each other was just another predictable pattern. This is not your problem, I said again, softer this time, and he studied me for a long second, not interrupting, not dismissing, just waiting, and it made me uneasy, because most people rushed to fill silence, to justify, to explain, but he did not. He let it sit there, heavy and deliberate, until I felt the need to speak again just to break it. I can handle my own life, I added, and something in his expression shifted, not disagreement, not agreement, something closer to recognition, like he had heard that sentence before from someone who believed it just as much as I did in that moment. Of course you can, he said finally, and I almost felt relieved, until he continued, the question is whether you should have to, and that stopped me, because it was not the kind of answer I expected, not dismissive, not patronizing, just inconveniently accurate, and I looked away first, down at the empty street stretching in front of me, quiet, ordinary, like the rest of the world had no idea mine had just tilted, and for a second I considered walking, just picking a direction and moving until my legs gave out, but I did not, because I had nowhere that felt like mine anymore, not the house behind me, not the future I thought I was building, and somehow he seemed to understand that too, because when I glanced back, he had not moved, still standing there with that same composed patience, as if time worked differently around him. "Where are you going to sleep tonight?" he asked, not invasive, not demanding, just direct, and I opened my mouth, then closed it again, because I did not have an answer that sounded real when spoken out loud. And that silence was enough. It told him everything, and I saw it in the slight narrowing of his eyes, the way he recalculated something internally, and before I could push back, before I could insist I did not need anything from him, he spoke again. "You can stay somewhere safe," he said, and I frowned immediately, instinct kicking in. "I do not need," I started, but he cut me off, not raising his voice, not interrupting harshly, just speaking over me in a way that made it clear he expected to be heard. "I did not say you needed it," he said, his tone even. "I said it is an option," and I hated that, hated how reasonable it sounded, how it did not feel like pressure even though it was guiding me towards something I had not chosen, and I crossed my arms tighter, searching for something to hold on to, some version of control that still belonged to me. "And what do you get out of that?" I asked, because nothing came without a reason, not from someone like him, and for the first time, he paused just a fraction longer before answering, his gaze steady, unreadable. "Clarity," he said, and I blinked, thrown off by the simplicity of it. "Clarity about what?" I asked, and his eyes did not leave mine when he replied, "About whether you walk away from this, or let it define you," and something about the way he said it made it feel less like a question and more like a test I had already started taking, and I realized then, standing there under that dim light, that this was no longer just about betrayal or escape, it was about what came next, and somehow, without asking, without forcing, he had already positioned himself as part of that answer, and the most unsettling part was not that I felt uncertain, it was that I felt seen, like he was not offering me a way out, he was offering me a different way forward, one that I did not fully understand yet, but could not easily refuse. There are moments in life when you realize the decision has already been made, not out loud, not in words, but somewhere deeper, somewhere quieter, and as I stood there looking at him, I understood that walking away would have been easier if he had pushed, if he had demanded, if he had acted like the kind of man I could refuse without thinking, but he did not, he just waited, and somehow that made it harder, because it left the choice entirely in my hands, or at least it felt that way. "Fine," I said finally. The word leaving my mouth before I could overthink it, and for a split second I almost took it back, but he only nodded once, like he had expected that answer all along, like this was not a victory or a surprise, just the next logical step, and that unsettled me more than anything else, because it made me wonder how much of this was already mapped out in his mind. "This does not mean anything," I added quickly, needing to draw a line somewhere, even if it was a fragile one, and his expression did not change, not offended, not amused, just steady. "It means you are not sleeping on the street tonight," he said, and I let out a small breath, because he had a way of reducing everything to something simple and undeniable, something that left no room for argument without sounding unreasonable, and before I could respond, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, his movements precise, controlled, as if even something as ordinary as making a call carried weight. "I will have a car here in 2 minutes, he said, not asking, not checking if I agreed, just stating it, and I blinked, caught off guard again, because 2 minutes sounded impossible, but something in his tone made it clear he was not guessing, he was informing, and I shook my head slightly, a reflex more than a protest. "That is not necessary," I said, though my voice lacked conviction, and he glanced at me, just once, a brief look that somehow said more than a long explanation ever could. "You have already accepted," he replied, and I frowned, because that was not how I remembered it, but when I opened my mouth to argue, the words did not come, because he was not entirely wrong, and that realization sat uncomfortably in my chest, like I had stepped into something without fully understanding the terms, and before I could sort through it, headlights turned the corner at the end of the street, smooth and silent, a dark car pulling up to the curb with a level of precision that did not feel like coincidence, and my stomach tightened, because 2 minutes had not been an estimate, it had been a guarantee, and he stepped forward, opening the back door as if it were the most natural thing in the world, not rushing me, not urging, just holding it there, waiting, and I hesitated, my eyes flicking from the car to him, to the house behind me where everything had just fallen apart, and for a second I felt suspended between two versions of my life, one I understood but could not go back to, and one I did not understand at all, and he seemed to read that hesitation without me saying a word, because his voice softened just slightly. Not enough to feel gentle, but enough to feel intentional. You are not losing anything by stepping forward, he said. You already lost it when you walked out, and that hit harder than I expected, not because it was cruel, but because it was true, and I looked at the open car door again, at the reflection of streetlights on the tinted window, and realized that whatever this was, whatever line I was about to cross, it had already begun the moment I chose not to open that bedroom door, and slowly, before I could talk myself out of it, I stepped inside, the leather seat cool beneath me, the door closing with a quiet finality that echoed in my chest, and as the car began to move, I glanced at him through the window, watching as he walked around to the other side, composed, unhurried, like nothing about this night had surprised him, like he had simply been waiting for it to unfold, and when he finally joined me in the back seat, the space felt smaller, heavier, filled with something unspoken, and I stared straight ahead, my hands folded tightly in my lap, trying to convince myself that this was just a temporary decision, just one night, just a place to stay, but deep down, I knew better, because nothing about him felt temporary, and the quiet certainty in his presence made one thing painfully clear: I had not just left my old life behind, I had stepped into his. The city blurred past the window in streaks of white and gold, streetlights stretching into long lines that made everything feel unreal, like I had stepped out of my own life and into someone else's without warning. And I kept my eyes forward, fixed on nothing, because looking at him felt like acknowledging the weight of what I had just done, and I was not ready for that yet. Not ready to understand why I had gotten into this car with a man I barely knew, a man who felt less like a stranger and more like something inevitable, and the silence between us was not awkward, it was intentional, controlled, like even the absence of words belonged to him, and I shifted slightly in my seat, the leather smooth under my fingertips, grounding in a way I did not expect, and after a few minutes, I could not ignore it anymore. Where are we going? I asked, my voice quieter than I intended, and he turned his head just enough to look at me, not surprised, not impatient, just acknowledging the question like it had been waiting its turn. Somewhere you can think clearly, he said, and I let out a small breath, almost a laugh, because that sounded simple, too simple for everything that had just happened. I can think anywhere, I replied, though even I could hear the doubt in my own voice. And he studied me for a second, his gaze steady. Unreadable. No, he said calmly, you can survive anywhere, but thinking requires distance, and that made me go quiet again, because there was something frustrating about the way he spoke, like he kept saying things I did not want to agree with but could not fully deny, and I turned back to the window, watching as the streets changed, the familiar blocks fading into something cleaner, quieter, the buildings taller, the sidewalks emptier, until it no longer felt like the same city I had lived in my entire life, and I realized then that this was not just about leaving a house, it was about leaving a version of myself behind, and that thought settled deep in my chest, heavier than I expected. You do this often? I asked after a while, the question slipping out before I could filter it, and he did not answer right away, his fingers resting lightly against his knee, still, controlled, before he finally spoke. No, he said, and something about that answer felt more significant than if he had explained it, like this was not routine, not habit, but something chosen, something deliberate, and I frowned slightly, glancing at him again. Then why me? I asked, because that question had been sitting in the back of my mind since the moment I stepped into this car, and for the first time, there was a pause that felt different, not calculated, not controlled, just measured, like he was deciding how much to reveal, and when he finally looked at me, his expression had not changed, but the weight behind it had. Because you walked away, he said, and I blinked, thrown off by how simple it sounded. That is not exactly rare, I replied, but he shook his head once, slow, certain. It is, he said, most people stay longer than they should, they argue, they demand explanations, they wait for something to make sense. You did not. You chose yourself without hesitation, and I swallowed, because that was not how I had seen it, not strength, not clarity, just shock, just survival, but hearing him say it like that made it sound like something else, something intentional, something worth noticing, and I did not know how to respond to that, so I looked away again, my reflection faint in the window, unfamiliar in a way I could not quite explain, and the car slowed as it turned onto a quiet street lined with tall trees and gated properties, the kind of place I had only ever seen from a distance, and when it finally stopped, I hesitated, my hand resting lightly on the door handle, because stepping out would make this real in a way the drive had not, and he seemed to sense that hesitation without me saying anything, because his voice came again, low, steady. "You can leave in the morning," he said, not a promise, not a reassurance, just a statement, and I nodded once, even though I was not sure if I believed that yet, and as I opened the door and stepped out into the quiet, the air cooler here, cleaner somehow, I realized that this was no longer just about finding somewhere to sleep, it was about stepping deeper into something I had already started, something that felt calm on the surface but carried a depth I could not see the bottom of, and as I followed him toward the entrance, one thought settled clearly in my mind: I had not come here by accident, and neither had he. The door opened before he even reached for it, not by magic, not by surprise, but because someone on the other side had been waiting, and that was the first moment I understood that this place did not operate like the rest of the world, because things here did not happen by chance, they happened because they were arranged to happen, and I stepped inside slowly, my senses sharpening as the quiet wrapped around me, the kind of quiet that did not come from emptiness but from control, from everything being exactly where it was supposed to be, and I glanced around, taking in the wide entryway, the polished floors, the soft lighting that made everything feel intentional, nothing excessive, nothing accidental, and for a second I felt out of place in a way that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with presence, like this space expected something from the people inside it, and I was not sure I fit that expectation. "You can relax," he said behind me, his voice low but steady, and I almost smiled at that, because relax was the last thing I felt, standing in a house that felt more like a decision than a location, and I turned slightly, watching as he moved past me with that same composed ease, as if every step he took belonged exactly where it landed, and I followed without thinking, because stopping would mean questioning everything again, and I was not sure I had the energy for that, not tonight, not after everything that had already shifted, and he led me down a hallway that seemed to stretch just far enough to separate the outside world from whatever came next, and when he stopped in front of a door, he opened it without hesitation, stepping aside just enough to let me see inside first. "You can stay here," he said, and I hesitated at the threshold, my eyes scanning the room, simple but precise, clean lines, neutral tones, nothing personal, nothing that revealed anything about the person who owned it, and that unsettled me more than if it had been overly decorated, because it felt like a space designed for function, not comfort, like it existed for a purpose rather than a feeling, and I stepped inside slowly, my fingers brushing lightly against the edge of a table just to ground myself, to confirm that this was real, that I had not imagined the last hour of my life, and when I turned back, he was still standing there, watching, not intruding, not leaving, just present in a way that felt deliberate. "Thank you," I said after a moment, the words unfamiliar in my mouth, not because I did not mean them, but because I was not used to saying them in situations like this, and he nodded once, acknowledging it without making it into something bigger, and for a second I thought he would leave, give me space, let me breathe, but instead he spoke again, quieter this time. "This is temporary," he said, and I frowned slightly, because I had already told myself that, I had already tried to frame this as something small, something manageable. "I know," I replied, but he held my gaze, steady and unyielding. "No," he said, "you believe it is temporary, but that depends on what you choose next," and something about the way he said it made the room feel smaller, like the walls had shifted just slightly closer, and I crossed my arms, not defensive, just trying to hold onto something solid. "And what do you think I am going to choose?" I asked, because I needed to understand where he stood in all of this, needed to know if this was just observation or something more, and he did not answer immediately, his eyes searching mine in a way that felt less like judgment and more like assessment, like he was not deciding who I was, but confirming something he had already seen. "I think," he said slowly, "you are standing at the edge of something you do not fully understand, and you are deciding whether to step back into what broke you, or step forward into something that will change you." And I swallowed, because that sounded too big, too final for a night that had started like any other, and I shook my head slightly, almost to clear it. "It is just one night," I said again, softer this time, more to myself than to him, and for the first time, there was something almost like a shadow of a smile at the corner of his mouth, not mocking, not amused, just knowing. "Nothing that matters is ever just one night," he replied, and that stayed with me long after he turned and walked away, the door closing quietly behind him, leaving me alone in a room that felt calm on the surface but carried a weight I could not ignore, and as I stood there, listening to the silence settle around me, I realized that he was right about one thing. This was not just about where I would sleep, it was about what I was becoming, and I was not sure I was ready to face that yet. I did not sleep, not really, because every time I closed my eyes, I heard it again, her laugh, his voice, the quiet betrayal that did not need to be seen to be understood, and I lay there staring at the ceiling, tracing the clean lines of a room that did not belong to me, trying to convince myself that this was just a pause, just a moment between two versions of my life. But the longer I stayed still, the more it felt like something else entirely, like I had stepped into a space where time did not move the same way, where decisions settled deeper, heavier, and when the first light slipped through the curtains, soft and controlled, not harsh like the morning I was used to, I sat up slowly, my body stiff from a night spent thinking instead of resting, and for a moment I did not move, just listened, expecting silence, but what I found instead was something quieter, more deliberate. The faint sound of movement somewhere beyond the walls, not rushed, not chaotic, just steady, and I realized then that this place did not wake up the way my old life did. There were no alarms, no overlapping noise, no sense of urgency, just a controlled start to the day, and that unsettled me more than anything else, because it felt like a world where nothing happened by accident, and I swung my legs over the side of the bed, my feet touching the cool floor, grounding me just enough to stand. And I moved toward the door with a hesitation I could not fully explain, because opening it felt like stepping further into something I had not agreed to understand yet, but staying inside felt worse, like hiding from a choice that had already been made, and when I finally opened it, the hallway was exactly as I remembered, quiet, composed, unchanged, like the night had left no trace behind, and I stepped out slowly, my eyes scanning without meaning to. As if I expected something to be different, something to confirm that this was not just another carefully controlled moment, and then I saw him, not at the end of the hall, not distant, but closer than I expected, standing near a window where the morning light caught just enough to outline him without softening anything, and he did not look surprised to see me, not even slightly, like he had known exactly when I would step out. Like this timing had already been accounted for, and I stopped. Without thinking, my hand still resting lightly on the doorframe behind me. "You are awake," he said, his voice calm, almost neutral, and I nodded once, because it felt like the only response that fit the moment. I could not sleep, I admitted, and he watched me for a second, not questioning, not dismissing, just acknowledging it in a way that made it feel less like a weakness and more like something expected. "That will pass," he said, and I frowned slightly, because the certainty in his tone made it sound like he had already seen the outcome, like he knew how this would unfold even when I did not. "You seem very sure about that," I replied, and something in his expression shifted, not a smile, not quite, but something that carried a quiet confidence. "People adjust faster than they think when they stop looking back," he said, and I looked away at that, because the words landed too close to something I had not fully processed yet, and I crossed my arms loosely, more for comfort than defense. "I am not adjusting," I said, though even I could hear how uncertain it sounded, and he did not argue, did not correct me, just stepped slightly to the side, creating space rather than closing it. "Then consider this a moment of observation," he said, gesturing lightly toward the open space beyond him, and I hesitated, because following him again felt like continuing something I still did not understand, but standing still felt like denying something I had already stepped into, and after a second, I moved forward, slow but deliberate, because even if I did not have control over everything happening around me, I could still choose how I walked through it, and as I passed him, I felt that same quiet awareness settle over me again, not fear, not comfort, something in between, something that made one thing clear: I had not just spent the night in his world, I had begun to exist in it, and I was not sure where that would lead, only that turning back no longer felt as simple as it should have been. The room he led me into was not a living room in the way I understood it. It was too precise, too intentional, like every piece of furniture had been placed not for comfort but for control, and I slowed without meaning to, my steps quieter against the polished floor, my eyes taking in details I could not ignore, the way nothing was out of place, the way even the light seemed to fall exactly where it was supposed to, and I felt it again, that same quiet awareness, like I had stepped into a space where everything had already been decided before I arrived, and I did not know where I fit into that yet. "Sit," he said, not sharply, not forcefully, just simply, and I hesitated for a second before lowering myself onto the edge of the sofa, my posture straight without trying, because something about this place did not allow carelessness, and he remained standing for a moment, watching me in that same unreadable way, before moving toward the far side of the room, pouring a glass of water. Without asking if I wanted it, and when he returned, he placed it in front of me with a quiet certainty, not offering, not insisting, just placing it there like it belonged, like I belonged there, and I wrapped my fingers around the glass, more for something to hold than because I was thirsty. "You are very good at this," I said after a moment, my voice softer than I intended, and he tilted his head slightly. "At what?" he asked, and I let out a small breath, searching for the right word. "At making everything feel decided," I said, and for a second, something almost like acknowledgement passed through his expression, not pride, not denial, just acceptance. "Decisions create stability," he replied, and I shook my head slightly, because that sounded too simple for what I was feeling. "No," I said quietly, "they remove choice," and this time he did not answer immediately, his gaze settling on me with a focus that made the room feel smaller, more contained, and when he finally spoke, his voice was lower, more deliberate. "Only for people who wait too long to make them," he said, and I looked down at the glass in my hands, watching the light reflect off the surface, because that answer landed somewhere deeper than I expected, and I did not know how to respond without admitting something I was not ready to say out loud. And the silence stretched again, but this time it did not feel controlled, it felt observant, like he was waiting to see what I would do with it, and I set the glass down carefully, my fingers lingering against the cool surface for a second longer than necessary. "You said I could leave in the morning," I said finally, lifting my eyes to meet his, and he nodded once, no hesitation, no resistance. "You can," he confirmed, and something about that immediate agreement unsettled me more than if he had argued, because it removed the excuse I had been holding on to, the idea that I was here because I had to be, not because I chose to stay, and I shifted slightly, my shoulders tightening just enough to feel it. "And if I do?" I asked, and again, he did not rush the answer, his gaze steady, patient, like he was not trying to influence the outcome, only to understand it. "Then you go back to what you left," he said, and I frowned, because that sounded too simple, too incomplete. "And if I do not?" I pressed, and this time, there was a pause that felt heavier, more intentional, and when he spoke, it was quieter, but carried more weight. "Then you move forward," he said, and I let out a breath that almost felt like a laugh, because that was not an answer, not really, it was a shift, a redirection, and I leaned back slightly, studying him in a way I had not allowed myself to before, taking in the calm, the control, the certainty that did not need to be proven, and I realized then that this was not about convincing me to stay, it was about showing me what staying meant without ever saying it directly, and that was more powerful than any argument, because it left the decision entirely in my hands, while shaping it at the same time. And I looked away first, my gaze drifting toward the window where the morning light had fully settled, clear and steady, and for a moment I imagined walking out, getting into a car, returning to a life that felt smaller now, more fragile, and the thought did not bring comfort the way I expected it to, it brought something else, something quieter, something more unsettling. And I realized then that the real question was not whether I could leave, it was whether I wanted to, and that answer was not as simple as it should have been. There is a moment when silence stops feeling empty and starts feeling like a decision, and I sat there in that room, staring at the light stretching across the floor, realizing that no one was going to push me one way or the other, not him, not anyone, because the choice had already shifted into something quieter, something internal, and that made it heavier, because it meant whatever came next would belong entirely to me. And I exhaled slowly, my fingers tracing the edge of the glass one last time before I stood, the movement small but deliberate, and he did not react immediately, did not interrupt, just watched, the same way he had since the beginning, like he was not waiting for me to decide, but observing how I did it, and I took a step toward the door, then another, testing the weight of it, the reality of leaving, and for a second it felt almost simple: just walk out, get in a car, go back to something familiar, even if it was broken, even if it hurt, because at least it was known. And my hand hovered near the doorframe, not touching it yet, because I understood something in that moment: once I walked through, I would not come back here the same way, I would not see him the same way, and that made me pause, because despite everything, despite the uncertainty, there was something here I could not ignore, something that had nothing to do with comfort and everything to do with clarity. And I turned slightly, just enough to look at him again, standing exactly where I had left him, composed, unchanging, like he existed outside of the hesitation I was feeling. And I realized then that he had never asked me to stay, not once, and that made this harder, not easier, because it meant I could not blame him for whatever I chose next. And I swallowed, my voice quieter than I expected when I finally spoke. If I walk out that door, I said, everything goes back to the way it was. And he did not answer immediately, his gaze steady, thoughtful, like he was considering the weight of the words rather than the question itself. And when he finally spoke, his voice was calm, almost neutral. No, he said, and I frowned slightly, because that was not the answer I expected. It never goes back, he continued, you just decide what you accept from it. And I let that settle, because it shifted something in my mind, something I had been holding onto without realizing it, the idea that leaving would undo what had already happened. And I looked at the door again, at the line between what I knew and what I did not, and for the first time, it did not feel like safety, it felt like limitation, like stepping back into something smaller than I had already seen. And that realization was quiet but undeniable. And I lowered my hand slowly, not touching the door, not opening it, just letting it fall back to my side. And when I turned fully toward him this time, there was no hesitation left in the movement, only a strange kind of calm, the kind that comes when the uncertainty has already passed. And I met his eyes, holding the gaze instead of avoiding it, because I understood now that this was not about being pulled into his world, it was about choosing to step into it, and that made all the difference. I am not going back, I said, the word steady, clearer than anything I had said since the night began. And he did not smile, did not react the way most people would. There was no visible satisfaction, no shift in posture, just a slight nod, almost imperceptible, like this outcome had always been one of several he had already considered. And that grounded me more than anything else, because it meant this was not about him winning or me losing, it was about something else entirely, something I was only beginning to understand. And the silence that followed felt different this time. Not heavy, not uncertain, but settled, like the room itself had adjusted to the decision. And I took a small breath, steadying myself in a way that felt new, not because I had found answers, but because I had accepted that I did not need them yet. And as I stood there, no longer between two doors but firmly on one side of them, one thought came through clearly, not loud, not dramatic, just certain: I had not been saved, I had not been taken, I had chosen this, and whatever came next, it would not be something that happened to me, it would be something I walked into on my own.